I'm pleased to be able to rise to speak on the Television New Zealand Amendment Bill. As previous opposition speakers have noted, we are opposing this bill. And, Mr Speaker, I don't really want to particularly relitigate all of the arguments around why we are opposing the bill, although I will briefly do that, because what I actually want to focus on today is what I think is the philosophy that lies behind this bill around the issue of public broadcasting. But I do want to note that from our point of view, this bill in many ways is about the beginning of the end of public broadcasting in New Zealand, because the National Party does in fact have a history of undermining Television New Zealand and indeed of preparing it for sale. And Mr Williamson knows some degree about that. In the 1990s there was a significant amount of work done to prepare Television New Zealand for sale and push its commercial ethos at the expense of its community role. And obviously when Labor came into office in 1999, we set about trying to return more of the ethic of public broadcasting to Television New Zealand. And obviously the Charter was a key component in that. And I mean, I would accept, as somebody who had a little bit to do with the implementation of the TVNZ Charter, that it did not turn out exactly as we had intended. It didn't actually provide the level of local content and the focus on those areas where the market wasn't providing in the way that we would have liked. And towards the end of our time in government, when Trevor Mallard was the Minister of Broadcasting, he attempted to make some changes to the way in which the Charter was funded. But, Mr Speaker, that's a very, very long way away from what the National Party have been doing since they've come into office. And we've seen hundreds of jobs gone from Television New Zealand, a 12.5% cut from the news budget, the news and current affairs budget. And all of this leads me to the belief that the Minister's statement, who's interjecting now, the Minister's statement in the first reading that TVNZ has effectively operated as a commercial broadcaster over recent years is actually where he wants to go. He actually wants to go, as National did in the 1990s, in terms of the overall commercial objectives, not interested in the community objectives, not interested in that way. And if the Charter is unworkable, as the Minister has said, then what's the replacement? Because what this bill does is it tells us an awful lot about what the government doesn't want to do, and doesn't tell us very much at all about what the government does want to do when it comes to public broadcasting. And in one sense, you can say, well, that's fair enough. National campaigned and said that they didn't want the Charter. They said that they wanted to get rid of the Charter. At one level, that's fair enough. Well, I want to know then what's there to replace it. Now, I think it's misguided to get rid of the Charter, because as someone who, as I said before, who had a fair bit to do with it, it was actually there to help give a framework for implementing those public service broadcasting objectives. Now, even if we concede that it didn't do that job properly, where is the replacement for that? And even if we actually concede that and say that the funding shouldn't be there, why take the Charter away? Why take away the framework, even if you don't think that the funding should be there? It doesn't actually make sense. Well, Mr Speaker, unlike the party opposite, I happen to think that public broadcasting is incredibly significant for New Zealand, because we are now living in a time when the ability to access content is seemingly limitless. People can go online and see all manner of different types of what content that we would traditionally have seen on TV, and that's fantastic. But this is actually the very time that we need an independent, comprehensive service that reflects our country and our values. And that's the role that Television New Zealand should be playing in terms of broadcasting. And there is no vision for that from the current government. The expanding market that we've got is driven for the most part by purely commercial and profit motives. The private equity firms that are currently behind TV3, their motives are very clear. They want to maximise the value for their shareholders. Well, that's fine for them, but that's not going to deliver us long-term public service broadcasting values. And the public need to know that there will be somewhere where that will be delivered. In Australia, the head of the ABC has described the ABC as Australia's town square, a place where Australians can come to listen and learn, to speak and be heard. Well, where's New Zealand's town square when it comes to broadcast television? That should be Television New Zealand. That should be the investment that the government's making. We now know what the government doesn't want to do. Well, where's the commitment to public broadcasting? And that commitment to public broadcasting, Mr Speaker, in my opinion, has to be more than just content. It has to be more than just programs. And I've said in this House before that I support New Zealand On Air. I think it's a good model for ensuring that there is New Zealand content. But there needs to be something more than just content. They say content is king when it comes to the internet and so on, and that's fine. But if we're actually going to assure ourselves that there'll be public service broadcasting values implemented in New Zealand, there needs to be a place for that. A strong institution that will actually support those values with the plethora of other opportunities. And that's not sufficient for the Minister to say that that's Television New Zealand 6 and Television New Zealand 7. We need a strong institution that allows thinking beyond individual projects. We need something that goes beyond just market logic and the fact that we put on programs that'll be attractive to advertisers. We need an institution that's providing some leadership in that regard, and that's Television New Zealand. That should be Television New Zealand. Because producers in New Zealand, program producers in New Zealand, do an extremely good job of producing very good high-quality content. But they too have to constantly look out for the bottom line, constantly look out, and some of them for their shareholders. And we need to make sure that not only is New Zealand on air there, ensuring that content is being created, but there's an institution that's looking out for where the market doesn't provide. Because it may come as a surprise to the members opposite, but in many cases in television, as in other walks of life, the market will not perfectly provide everything that we expect it to. It will provide some very good things and some very good local content. I know it's a shock to you, Mr Gunliffe, but it won't necessarily do it in television. And we actually need to know that our public broadcaster will be there when the market is not providing. And that's what public broadcasters across the world have been able to do, and I think that is what we should do. So, Mr Speaker, this bill is not a bill that the opposition can support, because while it repeals the Charter, it does not really give us an indication about where it is that the government wants to take public broadcasting, how it is that it's going to take that forward in the digital age. And in fact, what it leads us to believe is that the government does not, in fact, believe in public broadcasting. And we can certainly see that the Minister has made comments in terms of Radio New Zealand, which indicate that he doesn't believe in that kind of public broadcasting. Television New Zealand is an even more difficult case, because it has had its problems over recent years in terms of meeting that public broadcasting mandate. But there's no vision here to show me, Mr Speaker, as to how the government wants to do that. And abolishing the Charter it's a step for the government simply in looking at Television New Zealand as a cash cow. And in the 1990s, that was the very explicit, clear agenda. Now, because this government went into the 2008 election with its somewhat fake promise to not privatise and not sell state assets in the first term, we have to kind of take the government has to kind of take a slower process towards privatising, but that quite clearly is the agenda. So, Mr Speaker, this bill will now go to the Select Committee, I'm sure, even though Labor is opposing it. And when it does go to the Select Committee, I hope that submitters and committee members on the Commerce Committee will ask questions about where the government is going on public broadcasting, because public broadcasting is an incredibly important part of ensuring that New Zealand's culture and values continue to be reflected and exposed to the world. That's what Television New Zealand should be part of doing. It needs a vision to do that in the digital age. This bill does not provide that vision, and we do not support it.
Michael.